This video is the result of my own personal attempt to disprove Christianity over the course of about the last 6 months. And to begin, we ask an uncomfortable question. What if God wasn't something or someone you discovered, but instead it was something that your mind had to invent in order to make sense of the world? I was raised Catholic, and I eventually left the church, but years later I came back. Not out of fear or nostalgia, but because I encountered a side of Christianity I had never been exposed to before. This was Christian philosophy and metaphysics. I read the Church Fathers and the great metaphysicians and encountered a vision of reality that gave my world a kind of structure and beauty I hadn't experienced before. But the more I fell in love with Christian philosophy, the more I fell in love with philosophy as a whole, and with that came serious critiques against Christianity. The unanswered questions multiplied and objections became sharper, which made atheism seem more and more plausible to me. Eventually, I realized I couldn't keep pushing them away. If I wanted to be intellectually honest, I had to face these claims head on, knowing that if Christianity survived, I'd know it was true, and if it didn't, I had to follow that truth wherever it led. So this video and the series that follows is not a sermon or apologetics. It's a spark of doubt brought to its logical conclusion. And for the atheist I'm blessed enough to have watching this content, if you end up thinking, man, here we go, another Christian apologist asserting God where his reasoning doesn't justify, please watch to the end. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by what you find. And to the Christians, theists, or anyone familiar with my content watching this thinking, wow, did my dude really just lose the faith? Watch the end. I think you will be pleasantly surprised as well. Because, like I said, this isn't a normal theological debate. It's a deeper question. Is religion a discovery, or is it a cognitive necessity? This is where the psychological critique enters. Psychological critiques don't mock religion. They don't deny its effect on humanity, and they don't even deny its beauty or usefulness. They do something very simple. They relocate religion from reality to the human mind. These critiques are particularly dangerous to Christianity because if religion can be explained away as a cognitive necessity or a means of emotional regulation or symbolic integration, then faith becomes understandable, even useful, but ultimately optional. The highest order of human cognition, that of spirit, becomes not about truth, but about human nature, and God becomes a ghostly placeholder which ties together the incoherence of an otherwise chaotic world. And up to this point, notice none of this actually makes religion false. It just makes religion explainable without anything beyond the mind. So to continue my own story, as I began to study philosophy more and more, it eventually brought me to psychology. And this wasn't exactly a random move. For those who aren't familiar with the history of philosophy, during the Renaissance era, a philosopher named René Descartes wanted a philosophy that literally could not be doubted. He first attempted to prove that he existed, and that led to the cogito, or the I think. Descartes argued that if I even doubt my existence, I am first thinking about whether I exist or not, and I need to exist in order to be thinking. Thus, I think, therefore I am. And this seems like a trivial thought, but it was a huge shift in the scope of philosophy, because up until this point, philosophy was grounded in metaphysics in the tradition of Plato and Aristotle, starting with existence and what must be the case for things to exist in the first place. But Descartes started somewhere else. He started with the human mind as the starting point for inquiry because the very first thing that can't be argued against is experience. If I am experiencing something, thinking about something, like Descartes said, I need to exist. So if the first thing I can't doubt is my own experience, then the only way I can argue for other things is by grounding them in the fact that I am thinking about them. And once you start there, a certain trajectory almost becomes unavoidable. And here's where David Hume enters. Hume accepts Descartes' starting point and then presses it to its breaking point. If philosophy begins with the contents of consciousness, Hume asks, what exactly is given there? Not substances, not necessary connections, not enduring selves, but rather fleeting impressions and ideas linked together by habit. The self is not a tangible thing, it is a collection of thoughts. And causation? Hume points out that the way we reason about causation isn't something we can see, it's something that we expect. If I strike a billiard ball, I expect it to hit another and move that ball. But why do I expect that? Because of the principle of causation. Yet, where is causation on the pool table? It isn't an actual thing. It's a projection we use to predict what will happen based on repeated experience. This has huge implications. Causation becomes expectation, not necessity. The self dissolves into a bundle of perceptions. Normativity loses its footing and becomes a custom. In other words, Hume doesn't reject the turn to the mind. He completes it, and in doing so, he exposes a devastating implication. Once metaphysics is subordinated to epistemology, intelligibility itself begins to evaporate. So at this point, my faith wasn't the only thing being threatened. My ability to reason was. Now, up until the last 6 months, I argued against these things because I wasn't seeing these claims from the inside. I was seeing them from the outside, in a paradigm where the terms being used felt foreign and incoherent. So I basically hand-waved them away as ridiculous. This is until I really started to have my own doubts about my mind's capacity to reach the outside world. This is where the next philosopher started to really make sense and, quite frankly, gave me an existential crisis. Here enters Immanuel Kant. Kant appears precisely when philosophy seems to have talked itself into a corner. If Hume is right, then reason cannot justify causation, substance, necessity, or even the self. Yet, science still works, mathematics still binds, and experience still presents itself as ordered rather than chaotic. Kant takes this tension seriously and asks a radical question. What if the problem is not that the mind fails to reach reality, but that reality as we know it is already shaped by the mind? Kant accepts Hume's critique of metaphysics, but refuses the skeptical conclusion. He argues that causation, unity, identity, and necessity are not discovered in the world as things in themselves, nor are they mere habits. They are the conditions under which experience is possible at all. The mind does not passively receive reality, it actively structures it. And without these categories, there would be no experience to doubt in the first place. This move is brilliant and terrifying at the same time. Brilliant because it rescues science, normativity, and intelligibility from the Humean collapse. Terrifying because it does so at a cost. Reality as it is in itself is now forever inaccessible. We don't know the world as it is. We only know the world as it appears to minds like ours. Kant saves intelligibility, but he relocates it within cognition. Now, before I continue, I was familiar with Kant for a long time, but again, I kind of just said, well, if what he says is true, then nothing actually makes sense, so I just ignored him. But after thinking about it quite a bit more, I think my psyche was actually protecting me from this type of paradigm shift, because at the time, I don't think I could have mentally survived it. Then one day I thought, man, I really am trapped inside this mind. Everything is shaped by how I perceive things to be, but are they really like that? Then I thought of Kant. Boom. It hit me. This is exactly what he meant. All these things that I use to understand the world, like space, time, causation, necessity, they aren't necessarily how reality is in itself. They're the way my mind processes reality. And then I thought, well, have I ever made any important decisions based on these categories of reason? Yeah, I can think of one. My belief in God. Every single argument I have for the existence of God uses these categories and informs my consequential decision to conform my entire life to that belief. So yeah, it sounds like something big is at stake. So I started trying to save face. I started arguing, if this is true, then that is true, or this category must be real because without it, this other thing doesn't make sense. But then it dawned on me. I can't actually prove or disprove any of these categories without using them. I can't argue about necessity without causation. I can't argue about unity without quantity. I can't argue about existence without modality. Everything is like a house of cards, and the second I pull one out, the whole thing collapses, and my ability to reason with it. This presents a big problem because it means I can't argue for or against anything without the argument becoming circular. How did you realize your mental categories correspond to reality? Well, I used my mental categories. So how do I ever verify them if I'm forced to use them no matter what? And that led me to think, if all this is the case, how do I know my belief in God is actually warranted? How do I know I don't just need him as another category that makes the world coherent? And this is where we enter phase 2, the projection temptation. Let me explain. Ants live in colonies. Nature demands a means of navigation, so instead of symbolic communication, ants leave a trail of pheromones wherever they go, allowing the ant behind to follow that trail to food and safely return home. These trails help ants make sense of their surroundings, giving the illusion of intelligence. But sometimes ants get trapped in what's called a death spiral. A trail becomes so self-enclosed that they loop endlessly, marching until they die. And in that case, the ants aren't exactly malfunctioning. They're doing exactly what nature trained them to do. It's not a failure, it's a cost of an otherwise extremely effective system. What if the demands of consciousness cause humans to do something similar? What if consciousness demands that we follow a trail of intelligibility in order to make sense of the world, just like the pheromone trail for the ants? Now, the brain is composed of many distinct systems, each responsible for something different. But each one is fed information through the senses. But because the mind operates across so many different layers, biological, emotional, social, conceptual, it has to preserve a strand of coherence between them. For example, I experience hunger. Why should I eat? Because eating keeps me alive. Why stay alive? Because survival allows me to pass on genes and continue the species. Each explanation builds on the one prior across multiple levels at once. Without some unifying coherence, the system collapses. The mind can't tolerate isolated chaotic impulses with no shared meanings. And that coherence extends to the world outside the mind too. When the mind experiences certain things, it needs stable relations in order to respond at all. And these are those things that Kant was talking about. I can't understand father without the concept mother. I can't understand son without the concept daughter. So concepts themselves come in structured webs. And if you keep examining your conceptual foundations, you're forced to explain things like existence and non-existence, unity and distinction, identity and difference. And if you keep kicking the can down the road, you reach a point where explanation can't continue indefinitely. The mind requires some final ground of intelligibility, a highest point that holds the entire conceptual system together. And this is what gets called God. God becomes the center of our psychological paradigm. When explanations run out, the psyche supplies symbols. Can't understand why this universe is the way it is? God. Can't understand why you are the way you are? Christ. And when things fall short, there's a complementary symbol available. Don't like the world? Blame the devil. Don't like yourself? Blame the devil. Don't like the way you act? Blame the devil. This account becomes tempting because it explains religion without requiring anything beyond the mind itself. And it means religion isn't false, it's just psychologically inevitable. God becomes the highest possible concept, the point in which all other concepts are unified and grounded. So at this point, I started thinking to myself, this sounds like the most plausible counter-argument that there is against Christianity. But there's some presupposition that I'm missing, and I'm not quite sure what it is. And now we enter phase 3, what I call the fork. Right now, it helps to slow down and signal that we're moving from phenomenology to a possible ontology. And fair warning, this is where things become philosophically technical, but I'm going to try my best to keep it grounded. To backtrack, if we begin with thought alone, religion does appear as a projection. From the first-person perspective of experience, God is something we reason to. And phenomenologically speaking, God is a concept, because nothing can be known to the human mind except through phantasm, or what we call a conceptual representation. But concepts are not the same thing as fictions. Fictions are concepts that don't match what is real. And so far, we've entertained the idea that our mental categories don't correspond to reality, which is Kant's move. But
What is the alternative?
We hit a meta-epistemic fork with serious consequences because there's only two answers. Either our concepts do not at all correspond to reality, or they can correspond to reality, at least in some minimal sense.
If we say that they don't, then everything collapses into incoherence, including the claim that concepts fail to correspond to reality. So we can't have that. Because if things are only as they appear to us and not as they are, how do we know there are things in themselves at all? We become left with a sort of solipsism, where nothing is true except as far as it is true to me. It sounds liberating at first, in a Nietzsche-esque sort of way. We make the world what we want it to be. But then the self becomes the ultimate ground of intelligibility, and the self is contingent. It arises within reality and depends on conditions that precede it. A contingent mind cannot ground the conditions that make intelligibility possible in the first place. If Kant says the categories are just the structure of the mind, we have to ask, but what structured it? If mind is a product of reality, then conditions were in place that gave mind its structure before mind existed. So, pure projection can't be the final story. But if we take the other path, if we say concepts can correspond to reality, then we inherit with it a burden of proof. How do we know correspondence exists? One place to begin is the functional role concepts play in human life. Religious concepts serve a role in maintaining coherence within consciousness. Concepts like God integrate experience, orient action, and preserve meaning across domains. If these concepts help humans flourish, not merely as thinkers, but as biological agents embedded in the world, then they are useful. But usefulness alone isn't enough. A concept can only be useful if it corresponds, at least minimally, to something real. A purely illusory concept would have no stable real estate in the world. And now, let me be very clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying God is useful, therefore God exists. I'm not saying our concepts correspond to reality in a one-to-one mirrored way. I'm trying to say something more reserved. Concepts extracted from reality correspond to something true about reality. Take the concept of unity. If unity did not exist in reality at all, then perceiving unified wholes would have no practical value. It would be a pure projection. But we can apply the concept of unity to something like humanity as a whole, act on it, and see real positive consequences follow. That tells us our concept of unity isn't arbitrary. It latches on to something real. And the same with causality, multiplicity, and contingency. If I strike a coconut and it becomes multiple pieces of coconut, I can understand this through concepts like cause and effect, unity and division, and then use that understanding practically. If these concepts were merely projected with no correspondence, they wouldn't reliably guide our actions. Multiplicity as an object doesn't exist out there the way a coconut does, but the concept of multiplicity in my head maps onto something tangible in the world. That points to something big. I continue to think our inner conscious experience is itself a part of reality. We don't stand outside the world and imagine it from nowhere. So even if religion contains projection, projection isn't always a fabrication from nothing. It's the symbolic articulation of how a finite intelligence encounters an intelligible world. And at the very least, this shows reality is intelligible to the human mind. Now we enter phase 4, the conditions of possibility turn. So far, we've shown that cognition can't merely be a closed-loop projection. The mind is a structured system that depends on conditions it cannot itself account for. Projection is something the mind does, but it already presupposes intelligibility, structure, normativity, and direction. Psychic reasoning can reorganize content, but it can't generate the conditions that make content coherent in the first place. So now the inquiry becomes a conditions of possibility question. For us to grasp reality in a way that allows us to reorder content, draw inferences, and generate stable outcomes, reality itself must be able to communicate unity, order, relational structure, and stability. A radically chaotic reality would be unintelligible in principle, and then we couldn't map these same categories back onto it with any real success. If our concepts correspond to reality at all, even minimally, then there must be a compatibility between the structure of intelligence and the structure of what is known. And we have to admit, this doesn't mean mind and world are identical. I can feel a rock and understand it without grasping that its atoms are made of mostly empty space. Our intelligence is finite and proportioned to its mode of knowing, but correspondence without compatibility would be either miraculous or just a coincidence. And now the direction of dependence becomes decisive. Human intelligence arises within reality. It's downstream from what it encounters. So intelligence can't be constitutive of reality the way pure projection theories require. So what does this mean? It means intelligence must be structurally receptive to a reality whose order precedes it. What the mind grasps is not self-generated, but received. Taken together, we get a minimal conclusion. If the mind is structured, reality is structured, the mind arises within reality, and concepts can correspond to that same reality, then the structure of reality must be communicable to the structure of the mind. Now, that's a mouthful, but what does that mean? This minimal communicability of structure is what we mean by intelligibility. Intelligibility names the possibility that order can be received. A page filled with random scribbles is unintelligible because it lacks communicable pattern. But writing formed according to a shared grammar becomes intelligible because what is on the page and what is in the mind participate in the same structure. Intelligibility can't belong exclusively to mind or exclusively to the world. It names a relation between knower and known. Now, if we deny the structure of reality plays any role in that relation, we're left with only two options. Either the correspondence between mind and world is a lucky coincidence, or it is a brute fact. If it's luck, then there's no grounded reason mind should track reality rather than distort it. Truth becomes indistinguishable from successful illusion. But that's not how reasoning actually functions. When I present a mathematical conclusion, I can demonstrate steps and others can verify them independently. That's possible because each step is constrained by the one before it. If correspondence were merely lucky, no step would be more truth-constrained than any other, and agreement would be inexplicable. If instead correspondence is brute, it just is because it is, then intelligibility becomes ungrounded. And brute facts can't ground the conditions that make facts intelligible at all. Explanation would rest upon what explanation cannot explain. In both cases, intelligibility loses its authority. The universe may happen to be intelligible, but with no reason, meaning there's no reason to trust intelligibility at all. So that leaves the final question. What must reality be like for the universe to communicate its order to the mind in a way that is grounded and normative? Before we continue, it helps to summarize what we've uncovered by the process of exclusion. 1. Conceptual correspondence is real. Our concepts aren't closed projections. They latch onto reality in ways that allows correction, disagreement, and convergence. 2. That correspondence is normative. Some concepts are right and others are wrong. Some conclusions bind while others fail. 3. That correspondence isn't luck or brute fact. If it were, rational inquiry undermines itself. 4. The mind is produced by reality. So intelligibility can't be grounded in finite cognition without circularity. Now, if all these things are the case, reality must be structured by constraint. Constraint isn't an added assumption. It's just the name we give to whatever must already be the case for intelligibility and correspondence to exist at all. A chess game only works because certain moves are excluded before anyone plays. If every piece could just move anywhere it wanted, there wouldn't be more freedom. There would be no game. Constraint isn't added later. It's what makes the game possible. Once projection, luck, brute fact, and emergence have been ruled out, something has to account for intelligibility. And what remains is real exclusion. Some states are admissible and others are not. You can have a tree and you can have a rock, but you cannot have a rock that is a tree. You can't have something that is equal to itself and also not equal to itself. Also, reality must be norm-governed, not merely regular. Regularity describes what typically happens. Normativity describes what must or what must not happen. Non-contradiction isn't what typically happens. It's what must be the case for coherence. Reality must also be modal. Reality is not just what it is, but what can and cannot be. We can have a square and we can have a circle, but we cannot have a square circle. Finally, these conditions must also be real and prior to finite cognition, because cognition relies on order, and order can't function without these constraints already in place. So at this point, the question is no longer whether intelligibility exists. That's already been secured. The question is what kind of reality could possibly ground it. Whatever grounds intelligibility cannot be just another feature within reality, one more fact alongside others, because intelligibility is what determines what counts as a fact in the first place. So the ground we're looking for must operate at a deeper level than the states of affairs it governs. And an explanation can't be ontologically weaker than what it explains. If intelligibility involves normativity, exclusion, modality, then its ground must be adequate to those functions. Explanations that appear only to matter, efficient causation, statistical regularity, or emergence fall short, not necessarily because they're wrong, but because they presuppose the very constraints they're trying to explain. Material processes describe what happens, but don't explain what must or what must not happen. Causal relations explain transitions, but already rely on identity and exclusion. Statistical patterns presuppose a structured space of admissible outcomes. Emergent explanations assume lower-level determinacy from the start. And in every case, intelligibility is treated as a byproduct, but intelligibility is not a byproduct. It's the condition under which products, processes, and patterns can even be identified as such. And brute fact explanations don't work here either. If intelligibility simply is for no reason, then there's no reason explanation works, no reason coherence binds, and no reason inquiry is an accidental success. To stop at brute fact here isn't just not having an opinion, it's removing yourself from the conversation. So the ground we're looking for must satisfy a demanding set of conditions. It must sustain exclusionary constraint, not as habit, but by definition. It must determine a space of possibility and impossibility, rather than merely occupy one. It must account for normativity, not just describe regularity. And it must do so without depending on those same conditions in a derivative sort of way. So, in other words, the ground of reality must contain the capacity to determine what counts as coherent, possible, and intelligible. Now, notice here what's happened. By following the argument through exclusion rather than assertion, we've ruled out a wide range of explanations for intelligibility without committing to a theological conclusion. We've excluded the view that intelligibility is merely psychological, excluded emergence as sufficient, excluded chance and brute fact, excluded grounding in finite cognition. So what remains is not a gap filled by preference, but a space constrained by necessity. But what we're gesturing towards is more minimal and abstract, an impersonal metaphysical ground that constrains possibility and makes intelligibility possible. Not a being among beings, but the condition under which beings can appear as intelligible at all. Whether this impersonal ground can remain impersonal, or whether the features it must possess force us to reconsider that assumption, remains open. But that question belongs to the next step. For now, all that has been shown is this. Intelligibility is real, grounded, and authoritative. And whatever grounds it cannot be reduced to psychology, chance, matter, or brute fact. We have not arrived at God, but we have arrived at something that reality cannot do without. And if this argument goes beyond this point, it won't be because we want it to. It'll be because the structure of reality itself demands it. So, for the next step in the argument, you're going to have to give me about 2 to 3 weeks while we keep advancing this line of reasoning and see what we get. If you found this interesting, helpful, or even just thought-provoking, feel free to like the video, subscribe, or share it with someone who enjoys this kind of content. And if you thought this was ridiculous, complete word salad, incoherent gobbledygook, please drop a salad emoji in the comments because it keeps me humble and it keeps me working on my presentation. But if you stuck around and thought, wow, these are things I really haven't considered before, I'm genuinely glad. My goal lately isn't preaching or apologetics. It's burning away every presupposition and bias that can't justify itself. A kind of intellectual alchemy, if you will. So that said, thanks for watching and keep seeking the truth.